Easter is one of the most widely celebrated festivals in the world. It's left a deep impression on global culture, woven through our heritage in art, music, holidays, and traditions. It's even said that the round shape of this building, being based on the round shape of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, was inspired by the idea of eternal life coming out of the resurrection of Jesus, the location of which was said to be there where the church was built. But beneath the familiar cultural claim lies one stark question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Tonight we're thrilled to welcome Stephen Shaw QC, who will offer forensic reflections on the Christian claim that a dead man did come to life and walk out of the tomb. Stephen Shaw QC works as a senior advocate and a part-time judge in the Belfast High Court. He also works on the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in London, which holds to account the security services and other public authorities in their use of surveillance powers. All very hush-hush. We'll see what stories he can tell us. As an advocate, Stephen has represented national and local government and advised the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Concentrating on commercial, property, and regulatory law, his diverse clients include multinational companies, energy utilities and banks, as well as family companies and high net worth individuals. Stephen has also spoken on matters of faith and the Bible in a wide range of settings across the UK, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. Well, I will now welcome Stephen Shaw. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us this evening. It's a real privilege for us to welcome you. Please give Stephen a round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I didn't know whether anyone would come, and so I brought my wife just to make sure that I would have one friendly face in the audience, but I'm pleased to see that there are many friendly faces, and I look forward to an engagement with you by way of this text and questions. I don't promise answers, but I do commit to give you responses, whether they're answers or not, when that time comes. It's shortly after 8 a.m. and the car arrives at my home. The driver nods to me. A man gets out of the front passenger seat. I notice that he's carrying a gun. He opens the rear passenger seat for me and ushers me into the back of the car. I get in. The armed man gets into the front passenger seat and we set off. The car is armor-plated, and as I take my last sight of my dwelling house, I notice that the windows are bulletproofed and reinforced. That day, I'm on my way to work as a judge in the High Court in Belfast. And what I've just described to you is perfectly normal, and I'm in good hands. Let me tell you a true story about one of the cases that I heard there recently. It was a claim for compensation by a man that I will call Colin, because that was his name. He was a police officer, and he claimed that he had sustained PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of his service in the police force in Northern Ireland. The story began 40 years earlier when, fresh out of high school, Colin was an enthusiastic young police constable posted to a rural base in Northern Ireland. And one autumn day, he and his sergeant were in the patrol car, driving around their neighbourhood. They were waiting for something to happen. An informer within an illegal paramilitary organisation had provided a tip-off that in that area that day there would be an armed robbery. And so Colin and his sergeant, armed as they were driving about not knowing where or when the robbery would take place. As they drove into a village, they noticed that a car pulled up outside the post office, and two men pulled masks over their faces, checked their guns as they made their way from the car to the post office, where there was a lady just getting ready to collect her pension. The police stopped, challenged. There was a shootout. The lady who had gone that morning for her pension died in the shootout. The armed men escaped and were never found. You can imagine how disruptive, how shocking, how disturbing such an episode was for a young man at that age, 19, 20 years of age. He was struck by how close death had come to him. And for some considerable time, he was plagued by the thought that his shot, because he had shot at the men, was the bullet that had killed the old lady as she went to collect her pension. He managed to return to work and spent several decades serving as a police officer in Northern Ireland before he was discharged on medical grounds. Colin claimed compensation. It was my task to decide whether he was entitled to it, and if so, how much. He gave evidence before me. Each side called expert psychiatrists who gave evidence before me, as well as producing chunky reports that would have choked a donkey. They were probed, cross-examined, tested on their reports and their opinions. And after several days of this, it fell to me to assess all that I had heard and to face that lonely task of retiring to a room, finding a towel, wrapping it around my head, and trying to make up my mind what I thought and how I should decide. I had to ponder the witnesses and their demeanor, how they had impressed me or not, whether what they said was coherent or not, whether it was consistent, and whether it found support in anything else that was in front of me. When I came to write my decision, I began with a quotation that you see on the screen, a quotation by A.H. Carr in his book, What is History? Before you study the history, study the historian. That was the challenge facing me. Did I believe Colin as an historian as to what had happened and how he had coped, how he had wrestled with this episode? But life threw lots of other sticks at him, slings and misfortunes. He was involved in car accidents. He was involved in family bereavements. And all of these had played a part in the development of the condition that he suffered from and that eventually led to his medical retirement. So first I had to study the historian, Mr. Colin. I tell you that story, A, because it's true, but also because it struck me as a model of what we might do this evening together in the time we have. And I wondered, when I was invited to this occasion, whether I could ever sit down and write a decision on the case of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I'm going to try tonight with your help. And I'm going to follow the same approach, the same method that I used in the case of Colin the policeman. First of all, I'm going to try and assemble the materials that we've got to review and consider, the materials about Jesus. And then, having assembled them, we need to assess them. Are they reliable? Are they coherent? Are they supported by anything beyond their immediate source? But instead of me in a solitary fashion retreating to a room and writing a judgment, I'm going to invite you to join me in working out what is the best explanation of the materials. So step one is to begin with the materials. The primary materials are found in the New Testament. There are other ancient writings that reference Jesus, but the New Testament is central. The New Testament is, if you're not familiar with it, let me give you a bird's eye overview. It's a collection of 27 books, as they're called, written in the first century. They're drawn over different literary genres. You'll find history, you'll find letters, you'll find a strange book of apocalyptic. And the central figure is Jesus of Nazareth, as he is known to history. And let me try and sketch the story of Jesus in a brief, non-contentious way that I hope would not upset a serious scholar, whether he or she comes from a Jewish or a Christian or a non-religious background. Because a lot of what is clear about Jesus is not in dispute, certainly during his life, that he was born as a Jewish boy in Bethlehem in what was then Roman-occupied Judea, that he was raised in a provincial backwater in the north of the country called Nazareth. That's why he got the name Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a very common name. And so to mark him out from the other little boys and other men called Jesus, he was Jesus of Nazareth. And he burst onto the public arena aged around 30. And when he did, he caused a storm by what he said and by what he did. He spoke about loving God first, and he spoke about loving neighbors as yourself. He was reported to perform exceptional healings and to display a power over nature that allowed him, for example, they said, to command a storm to suddenly be still, and famously to walk on Lake Galilee. The leaders of the Jewish people considered him a blasphemer because he was making claims, they thought, he was arrogating to himself equality with God. And so by their light, he was worthy of death. They brought him before the Roman governor, known to history as Pilate, who sentenced him to death as a supposed king of the Jews. That was the official title when he went to the place of public execution outside the walls of Jerusalem. And he was put to death by that form of punishment refined by the Romans called crucifixion, not invented by them. It was several hundred years earlier before the Romans got to it. It was around by the Phoenicians, but it was developed and honed to a magnificent, cruel form of punishment, execution, where a man asphyxiated as he tried to push himself up to catch a breath. And for every breath that he would take, he was forcing himself up on the nails that supported his limbs. And eventually he grew tired and died. That was after beatings and mockings. And they pronounced him dead. And what I've said to you so far is not doubted by serious historians. The problems now start for the historians. What happened next? The New Testament claim is that upon death he was buried in a tomb of a well-known public figure known as Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of a ruling council amongst the Jewish people. But within a few days, the tomb where he had been laid as a corpse was said to be empty. The corpse was missing. More than that, there were claims that Jesus was no longer dead, but that he had returned fully to life in the same recognizable body, yet transformed in remarkable ways. There were numerous claims of what I'm going to call the post-mortem appearances, sightings in a range of places by groups, sometimes small, sometimes large, as well as individuals who claimed that they saw him. Not only that they saw him, but that he spoke with them, he ate with them, and he assured them that he was alive in the power of an indestructible life. Now pause there, because I expect that if you're at all a thinking person in Cambridge, as I imagine you all are, the first question is, could such a thing ever happen? Well, that depends on your worldview. As a theist, I believe there is a God who created the cosmos that we cannot measure, that it operates under regular rules or laws that he has set, and which scientists can follow and observe and study. And very simply, in a sentence, if there be a God, there can be acts by that God. I have friends who reject the existence of such a being. They conclude that because there isn't such a God, there cannot be acts of that God in the cosmos. And I understand that. But ladies and gentlemen, that is a philosophical question, not an historical one, not a scientific one. And what I'm going to invite you to do, whether you are a theist or not, is to set aside your philosophy and to travel with me as a mere humble lawyer to look at the material, the evidence that is available, and to consider it, and to ask yourself, who has the best explanation for this material? So let me start with the New Testament. When I was looking at Colin's case, I needed to know whether Colin was a reliable historian or not. I also had to decide between competing psychiatrists as to whether one of them was to be preferred as more reliable than another. And I came to the conclusion that one of them was streets ahead of the others in terms of their reliability. So is the New Testament material reliable? What I've given to you is effectively a summary of the New Testament. If you haven't read it for yourself, I encourage you to do that. All well-read people will want to do that. The texts themselves were written close in time to the events. The texts disclose significant telltale signs of eyewitness observation. The texts that eventually came to be translated and are available are abundant in their copies and the quality of the copying. There is very good work done in this by Cambridge's own Peter Williams. Peter J. Williams of Tyndale House has a marvelous book, a short, easy-to-read book, Can We Trust the Gospels? If you want a bigger book on the same theme, Richard Bauckham has a book entitled Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. This is not a session to talk about the reliability of the Gospels as a distinct topic. That's a very important one, and if Peter hasn't done it, Peter should. But what I want to do is just draw to your attention a couple of points on this theme as to the reliability, because if the New Testament is not reliable, then we're on very shaky ground. Scholars of all stripes accept that what you see now on the screen is a very early creed. It captures the beliefs of the first Christians, written very soon after the events, and it reflects the wording of a creed or a statement of belief that was in circulation within half a dozen years of the events. Let me read it to you. It might be familiar to some of you. It's found in what we call the letter by Paul to the Corinthians, the 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. And this is what he says. I hope you can read the text. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Pause, there's the tradition. He's saying this is what is believed, and I'm passing on what was believed and received. And here it comes. Notice the verbs. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. That he was, verb 2, buried. That he was, 3, raised on the third day. Notice that phrase. We'll see it again pop up in a non-Christian writer in the year 93. He was buried, he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Cephas being a name for Peter, one of the apostles, then to the 12, the rest of the apostles. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Pause. In other words, that constituency, that group of eyewitnesses are still around. And if you want, you can check this out with them. Then, verse 7, he appeared to James. Pause. James here is a reference to the brother of Jesus, the half-brother, son of Mary, who did not believe that Jesus was anyone special during his lifetime. He was at least a skeptic, if not worse. But the tradition was that Jesus appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, says the modest Paul, he appeared also to me. And the man who wrote this started out as a devout non-believer in Jesus as a risen Christ. He believed that Jesus was not only a blasphemer who deserved to die, but was under God's curse when he did die. But now he says he appeared to him. So this is not something that developed late or after a long period of reflection. This was what the Christians were saying right from the first few years after the event. The quality of the observers as eyewitnesses is what Peter Williams addresses helpfully. And I'll just highlight a couple of features. Botany. The Gospels describe a type of tree by the correct description that is found only in that part of the world. How would you know that unless you had seen it? They were able to describe with remarkable local knowledge the weather features, how on Little Lake Galilee, which the locals thought was big and they called it a sea, that sudden squalls could arise and calm down quickly. Peter Williams and Bauckham are very strong and clear in dealing with names, that there are a number of names which for some time scholars could not identify where those places were until archaeology found them. But even more remarkable are personal names. And I know that Peter Williams is doing a study with colleagues about names in the Old Testament, but this is the result of work on names in the New Testament, which, like names anywhere, go in fashions. The names of young boys and girls in that part of the world at that time had a pattern which was distinctive to that place. Jewish boys were called by different sorts of names in Alexandria and other places where they were in large numbers, but when it came to first century Judea, there were a distinctive set of names. And so Simon was one of the most common names. And that is why Simon had to be given a nickname to distinguish him from the other Simons that were around, something to disambiguate him, as they call it. And what the studies have done, both by Peter Williams and Bauckham and others, including Jewish Israeli scholars, is to demonstrate that the the names that were found, not just amongst the followers of Jesus, but amongst the people that he encounters, are the very names you would expect. They are the names of real people in a real place at a real time, because the writers were there. So it's not only that the texts are close in time, it's not only that they have remarkable features of eyewitnesses, they also carry embarrassing disclosures. You have the stories of the close disciples of Jesus behaving badly. One of them taking a sword and cutting off a man's ear rather than allow Jesus to be arrested. You have Peter, who goes on to become a major leader in the church, swearing at a fire and disavowing any knowledge of Jesus. Those are not the sorts of stories that your PR advisor would want to go into the record, but they did. The message was controversial right from the start. And those who proclaimed it faced danger, not just unpopularity, not just social ostracism, but real danger, and many of them died. So the texts themselves are remarkable and have compelling features about them, you might think. But as for the copies, well, some of you might be interested in ancient history, and if you are, well, you have my sympathy. But here is a slide which, in a snapshot, shows you the sorts of numbers of texts, their earliest date and the time gap between the original texts and the New Testament, by contrast. And you'll see that, to put it simply and in an Irishman's terms, the New Testament doesn't win by a nose. The New Testament leaves everyone else standing in terms of the number and the proximity to the events. So the New Testament is, you might think, at least a serious set of data that we've got to wrestle with. But it's not just the New Testament. When I was dealing with the case of Colin, I wanted to see if there was anything that would corroborate his account. And I was especially impressed by how one of the psychiatrists pored over his medical records and his employment records to tie up events and to show patterns that were not to his credit. These were things that were outside what he was directly telling me. Voices coming from outside him. And so, when we come to these claims that are made about the resurrection, you can ask the same question. Is there anything, anyone speaking outside the Christian circle? And in that, I want to introduce you to Dr. Tom Schmidt, an American, and I hope you'll forgive him for that, who published last year at Oxford University Press, and I hope you'll forgive him for that, a book which is entitled Josephus and Jesus. If you're interested, you can download it free, and if you're very enthusiastic, you can go and pay an exorbitant amount of money to OUP and get the book, as did I. And let me explain why this book is significant. Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat, born shortly after the events of Jesus' death into a family of priests. He moved in elite circles amongst the Jews. He was trained as a priest and went on to become a budding military man in the northern part of the country when they were gathering themselves to try and throw off the Roman occupation. The battles didn't go so well for Josephus, and so he found that he was better off throwing in his lot with the Romans, which he did. And he ended up going and living in Rome and writing thousands and thousands of words about the history of his people and his nation, explaining, if you like, as the Jerusalem, now based in Rome, correspondent of the Jewish people, who the Jews were to the Romans. Within his writings, in or about 93 or 94 in the Common Era, or AD, depending on how you like to describe it, he wrote a paragraph that references Jesus. And this is a controversial, and was very controversial until Schmitt's book last year, because it seemed to say things that were favorable about Jesus to such a degree that hostile scholars and even sympathetic scholars suspected that a Christian had corrupted the paragraph because it seemed to be just too pro-Jesus from someone who was not a follower of Jesus, who remained distinctly outside the Christian camp. What Schmitt does in this book is he researches not just the materials that were available, but also compares it with other translations and other languages, and then produces at page 204 the translation that I've put on the screen, and I'm going to read it to you. And I have highlighted some phrases because they are important. As you remember that this is the voice of someone who is not a sympathetic person towards Jesus. And what Schmitt demonstrates is that this is to be regarded as authentic. And that's because when it's properly interpreted and properly translated, it's not as positive as it seemed at first. And this is what it says. And in this time, there was a certain Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, a teacher of men who receive truisms with pleasure. Let me pause. That's, if you like, a very skillful put down of Jesus' teaching. They're merely truisms, and they're received by certain people. And he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was thought to be the Christ. Pause. Not that he was, but that he was thought to be the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, I'll come back to that phrase, those who at first were devoted to him did not cease to be so. For on the third day, notice that, I said I would come back to it, a voice from outside the New Testament, a voice from outside the Christian community, that something happened on the third day. It seemed to them that he was alive again. Given that the divine prophets had spoken such things, that's a reference to the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, that had prophesied that a special and wonderful person would come from God, and they were claiming that this was he. The divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him, and up till now the tribe of the Christians who were named from him has not disappeared. I asked you to notice the phrase in bold, the first men among us. And what Schmitt has done is he has demonstrated in the book that I commend to you that Josephus, given his social circle and those he mixed with as he grew up and those he worked with, had access to men who were present on the night that Jesus was tried. The commander under whom Josephus served when a soldier in Galilee was a son of the high priest at the time of the trial of Christ. One of the others that Josephus worked with was the son of Gamaliel, who was part of the ruling council. So Josephus is mixing, hanging out with, we would say, with the sons of the high priest, the son of Gamaliel. This is known to history. These are the men who were the first among us, as he puts it, 60 years earlier, when Jesus was put on trial in the house of the high priest. So what I want to do is to, in the next slide, pull together what I'm going to suggest can be drawn from both the New Testament and from Josephus. the key elements about Jesus. We're still at the task of assembling. That he died of crucifixion under Pilate, that he was buried, that initially his followers despaired, but that 3 days later, as Josephus has it, the tomb was empty. The followers, both skeptics such as James and Paul, as well as those who were sympathetic at the time, claimed multiple and diverse post-mortem appearances. The disciples went out boldly proclaiming resurrection in the very city where he had been put to death, and taking it beyond that city into the Mediterranean basin. The church, as it became known, went out preaching that message from the start, as we saw in 1 Corinthians, and that people who had been brought up as devout Jews came to worship Jesus as though he were God, and to switch their holy day from the Sabbath to start celebrating Sunday because it marked the third day, the day of resurrection. Those are the materials which are base, I'm going to suggest to you. And now what I want to do in the time we've got left is to look at three and to consider the claims and the explanations given by those who reject resurrection. The first feature is the so-called empty tomb, or what happened to the corpse. The second are those post-mortem appearances. And the third is what I'm going to call the Easter movement that was birthed in Jerusalem of the first century and spread into a hostile world. Our focus is trying to find the best explanation for all of these three pieces. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. I want you, the challenge is to help me put together these three pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that fit best, not just explain one element, not just explain two, but all three. So the empty tomb. What happened to the corpse? You'll remember that it was taken to a tomb of a well-known public figure in a findable place, and no one ever produced the corpse. How do you explain it? I'll tell you shortly how it's explained in a naturalistic way, but there's the challenge. The post-mortem appearances. On the slide, you'll see that there are 10 recorded with the Bible references. And what is striking about these as you run your eye over them, if you're familiar with the texts, and I'll share something about them if you're not, is that they are marked by different locations, different times of day and night, different audiences, different sizes of audience. Sometimes it's an individual and sometimes it's a small group, sometimes a larger group, sometimes a very large group is claimed. But they all describe the same person who engages, who speaks, who eats. And none of them expected it. Then the third piece of the jigsaw is the Easter movement that is birthed in Jerusalem of the first century, when fearful followers who were frightened for their own lives, because if their leader Jesus could be arrested and put to death, what hope would they have? But not just followers who were devoted to him, skeptics such as the hard-nosed Pharisee and Christ hater Paul, and James, that brother who, in a way that you can only understand if you've watched brothers grow up, and sibling rivalry, that reluctance to recognize and to acknowledge the older brother who is special. James would not have it. But he comes to make the claim that he is alive. So you have the tomb empty. You have these diverse appearances reported that no one expected. And thirdly, then, the movement in Jerusalem. The first witnesses to these events were said to be women, which was a problem for the contemporaries in the Mediterranean world who did not regard women as being reliable as witnesses in a court. I say nothing about that today. But they were not relied on in courts across the Mediterranean basin, and especially amongst the Jews. The message that they took was a scandal. They changed their day of worship, and they worshiped Jesus as if he were God. So you've got a missing corpse, a whole bunch of reported appearances, and the birth of a movement that takes the world over the years and decades and centuries by storm. How do you explain that? Well, if you do not accept the claim by the Christians, this is how you go about explaining the empty tomb on a natural basis. This is taken from a book by a man called Andrew Loke, who wrote a book entitled Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, a New Transdisciplinary Approach. And he works through, in a logical manner, the options as he has read the literature. And so the first one is that Jesus escaped. He didn't die. The tomb was empty because he escaped. Or, if he didn't escape, he wasn't buried because he didn't die. Or if he did die, he was buried and he remained buried. We just don't know where. Others say he was removed by agents, non-agents, such as earthquakes or animals. Others say, no, we think that he was removed by agents, whether they were friends of Jesus, enemies of Jesus, or a neutral party such as a grave robber. So those are the naturalistic explanations for the empty tomb. Moving on to the appearances. How are they explained by people who will not hold to a supernatural intervention? Again, Luke has identified from the literature a series of options. Number one, it's a legend. It never happened, of course, and the claims that they happened are simply legendary. The problem with that is that they were reported and claimed very, very early after the events. Secondly, some will say there was simply no experience at all. These reports, paper refuses no ink, and people can make claims, and there never was any appearance at all. Others say, well, there was an experience, but it was within the minds only of those who claimed it. It was intramental. There was no proper stimulus outside them to stimulate it, so it was, if you like, some will call it hallucinations, some will call them subjective visions or stimulus or religious intoxication or enthusiasm or illumination. These are all terms that are drawn from the hostile literature, seeking to explain these appearances within the heads of these witnesses who claim to be witnesses. And others say, well, we'll not go with that, but we do think there was something outside their heads that triggered these reports, and we suggest that it was a person, but it wasn't Jesus. It's a case of mistaken identity. And others say, well, we think it was Jesus, but you remember he didn't die on the cross. Or if he did die, and then they get stuck. It was Jesus who had escaped completely, or it was Jesus who had swooned, who had fainted, who had been taken down, who had been revived, whether by his followers or by the the tomb, and who then managed to come back out and persuade his followers that he was the resurrected Son of God. And for him, they should go forth into a world that was hostile, incredulous, and that they should proclaim him as the very answer to the world's problems, beaten up as he was. Those are the explanations put forward for the post-mortem appearances. And the third piece of the puzzle is the Easter movement. How do you explain that? Well, here the natural explanation is that those who were the founders were deceived. They were tricked, they were wrong. Or, more sinister, they were not deceived, they themselves were deceivers. They knew full well that this was not true. But they set about a grand conspiracy, a hoax on the world to claim that this man had died and been brought back to life again. That doesn't really seem to fit well, does it, with their known standards of morality and their own commitment to this message and a willingness to suffer for it, indeed to die for it in some cases. What about all those over the years who have followed since? Well, if you are such a person, then I'm here to tell you that you're deluded, according to this thesis. Because he never did rise, the appearances didn't happen, and the Easter movement, the church, is a delusion that has been foisted upon the world. So now I've run out of my time, and I'm going to ask you to help me work out what you think is the best explanation of those three pieces. I want to encourage you to think about it, put your texts to the number that you saw on the screen, and can I encourage you, if you are starting to explore this topic, to continue with your exploration. But I warn you, there are skeptics who started exploring this who, to their surprise, concluded that it was true. Let me tell you of a couple of them briefly. One was an award-winning press reporter in Chicago called Lee Strobel, who came to the conclusion that Jesus did rise from the dead. He wrote a book called The Case for Christ. Another was a cold case detective in LA by the name of J. Warner Wallace, who set out to demonstrate that Jesus did not rise from the dead using the skills that he developed and practices as a cold case detective, and ends up writing a book which you can buy entitled Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels because he came to believe it. If it happened, then the significance is simply impossible to understate. Mike Hood has written a book that was the subject of a session here recently, The If That Changes Everything. I recommend the book to you. And he's very good both on the evidence for the resurrection, but also the significance. If it happened, it is a vindication of the claims made by Jesus, those arrogant claims to deity that led to his rejection. They come to be viewed more seriously if he's able to rise from the dead. But I find myself drawn to the words of a Belfast man like myself. He also spent some time here and in that other place. His name was Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis. And he says that by rising from the dead, Jesus has, quote, forced open a door that had been locked since death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened. End of quote. Lewis essentially says, if this happened, it is the most important thing. But then if it didn't, then it's simply totally unimportant. So I thank you for your patience. I know that some of the seats in the jury box are very uncomfortable. But I now invite you to text the number, to take a break, I think, Tim, and then we will endeavor to respond. And those difficult questions that are beyond me, which will be the majority, apart from my name, age, and address, will be addressed by Dr. Tim Lawrence. Thank you.
Right, let's bring those conversations to a temporary pause, and I hope that we can carry them on over a glass of wine, over a cracker and cheese, because it's time to welcome our speaker back to the podium, Stephen Shaw, KC. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for your questions, which are still coming in. And so I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because there are too many and time has fled. So let me try and lift out a couple of themes that come through and point you in directions that I think might be of assistance. There are some questions, a number of them, about Schmidt's book and about Josephus and the significance of Josephus. I only give you a very brief summary of what Schmidt does. Some of the questions were asking about the other translations and whether there were different translations and so on. All of that is addressed in the book, and so I encourage you to read the book on the free version if you can get it, and if not, go and spend too much money on the other. But he does address that. It is a scholarly book. It is not a popular book in that sense. It is a scholarly book wrestling and dealing with this from a man who is a senior scholar with a PhD from Yale. So I encourage you to look at that. But Josephus, I'm not putting Josephus forward as an eyewitness. What I'm suggesting about Josephus in the way I sought to present it was to say that when you come to any sets of claims, and one question was about medieval claims of all sorts of strange and wonderful happenings, and historians and modern people don't accept all that they read, nor should we. And I'm not suggesting that any of us should just accept blindly and believe anything and everything that is said. That's not what this exercise was about. It was an exercise rather to weigh evidence, to try and assess what is the best explanation. I'm not claiming to be able to prove or disprove any of these things, but to ask you to use the critical skills and abilities that you have and that you employ every day in your life, and that you would be employing if you were sitting in a jury box. You'd be having to decide the guilt or innocence of someone charged with some serious offense. And you don't have access to all the facts, and you don't have an eyewitness to all that transpired. And what you've got to do is to take the materials that are presented to you and to decide, when this is weighed, what do I conclude? Is there enough here to convince me that this thing happened or didn't happen? And I'm not saying simply because it's in the Bible that one believes it. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that when you allow, as I think you can and should, that the texts of the New Testament are to be taken seriously as eyewitness accounts, and see what they record as believed amongst the first followers of Jesus, remembering who they were. They were first century Jews who knew that, according to their teaching and traditions, there was to be a great resurrection, but that was to happen at the end of time, and it was to be a general resurrection. What they were not expecting was that one man would be resurrected in this form now. N.T. Wright has a book which makes this point very forcefully, that when you remember who these people were and the context in which they were living, the claim that they made is simply astounding. You never could have predicted it. You never would have expected it, because they didn't anticipate such a thing happening. And so when you have first century Jews from that culture making the switch that they did, it allows you to draw the conclusion that something remarkable happened. Now, either it was that the supernatural explanation solves these three pieces of the jigsaw. For me, that is an explanation that answers all three pieces, but it depends on whether you accept the supernatural. And if you don't accept the supernatural, it seems to me that you struggle explaining all three. You might make some headway with explaining one or two, but I've yet to find any plausible explanation of all three on a purely naturalistic basis. None that has persuaded me that I should abandon this and draw the conclusion that it did not happen. And that's the exercise that I went through when I was a much younger man, because I had been brought up in a church-going family in Northern Ireland, which you might remember was a country plagued by such church-going people. And I had no real interest in simply following a tradition, a religion, a faith, because it was my historic background, it was familiar, it was comfortable. I wanted to be satisfied that it was real, that it was true. And so in my own rather amateurish way, I made an investigation for myself and looked at the evidence as best I could assemble it, and the materials and the books and so on. There are lots of books at a popular level and also at a scholarly level on this subject. And I drew the conclusion that it was worth believing, that there was sufficient for me not to shoot out my brain and believe it because I wanted to believe it, but to believe it because there was sufficient reasonable evidence for it. And that is the conclusion I drew then, and it's the conclusion I still hold to, that the best explanation for this is not what you would expect, because you don't expect a dead man to walk out of a tomb, but that the best explanation is that a remarkable, supernatural thing happened. And for me, that answers all three. Now, some asked about some of the writers I mentioned, Strobel and Wallace, who were skeptics. Their wives came close to a faith position and took a faith position, and then they set about their investigations. And I think that is true, that is the way that happened for them. But I've met many men who were not persuaded because their wives thought something, and who set about their own investigation to be satisfied for themselves. They didn't want to just believe it because their wife believed it. And in fact, Strobel makes clear that he did not want to believe it. He thought it was a money-making racket that he was out to expose. And so the fact that their wives were already sympathetic is true. But what it does highlight is that there's another dimension to this that I haven't mentioned, and it is the changed lives in people who come to the conclusion that Jesus really did rise from the dead. So that Strobel was not just investigating the materials and the hard evidence and the scholars that he visited. And if you've not read the book, I recommend it to you. It's a very well-written piece. But also he was able to see a transformation in the demeanor and in the conduct of his wife. And there is a sense in which that is part of the evidence. I've not given you all the evidence for the resurrection. There is the body of evidence which is found in witnesses who say in the 21st century, Jesus is alive because I have met him too, which was the claim that Saul of Tarsus, who became the great apostle Paul, made. He didn't expect to meet a risen Jesus. It was his business, his life mission, to crush this blasphemous, offensive nonsense. After all, the Tanakh did say, did it not, in Deuteronomy, that a person who was hung on a tree was under God's curse. So how could someone who was cursed by God be the Messiah? It was a nonsense. Until. So how do you explain life transformation of that sort, of that degree, where he goes out into that hostile world and ends up paying with his life for the claim that he has seen the risen Jesus? Not just that he heard about it, not just that it was reported to him, though it was, but that he himself had this personal encounter And of course, the resurrection, which has been our focus, is not the greatest miracle of all. The greatest miracle of all is the incarnation. If God the Son was able to shrink and take up residence in the womb of a peasant girl, to become an infant born in humble circumstances with tiny fingernails and eyelashes, who had to be winded and cleaned and taught to walk, who spent his boyhood in that despised area where they made fun of him because of the way he talked. He was an unsophisticated man in terms of his accent. If the Son of God, that's the claim, did that, is it any real surprise that he has power over nature, to walk on water, to multiply fish and loaves, to make water into wine? He does that every season anyway, doesn't it? The wine that you're going to consume, if you do, is water that has been processed, and he was able to accelerate it. But if you're the Son of God in a human body, which is the claim, well, what's hard about that? And if you're the Son of God in a human body, what's hard about touching someone and giving them sight that they never had, or cleansing them of a leprous disease that no one else would even dare come close to, if you're the Son of God? And so the question always comes back to something which is bigger than the resurrection, bigger though that is. But the claim is that Jesus of Nazareth lived, died, and rose again, ascended to heaven, and will come back. And that's when it really bites. That the one who died and rose again, exalted to the right hand of God, is coming back to judge the world. That's the full, fat message of Christianity. And the resurrection is key to it, because they recognized right back in the first century that if this was not true, if this thing did not happen in space-time history, then the claims they made were bogus. They were found to be misrepresenting God. They were liars, and they had nothing to offer the world. In fact, Paul says that of all the people in the world, they're the most pathetic, the most to be pitied. What we've done is we've just touched on a little thing, but it's a big thing in terms of its importance and significance. And what I encourage you to do, if you're looking at these things seriously, is to continue the search. There are people here who will be able to help you with that, guide you towards the books that I've mentioned and other resources at various levels, as I say, from popular, easy to read materials that young people especially can enjoy, right through to heavy tomes that are useful to prop up a wonky table or to keep a door closed if you want it on a drafty night. So there's all sorts of material, because this is important. And Christians are not afraid of engaging with it and seeking to give responses, which is why I said at the start, I wouldn't give answers, but I would give a response. So I hope I've answered or responded to sufficient numbers of the questions that were posed, but I realize that I have more than trespassed upon your grace and your patience, and refreshments await.